In preparing for this talk, I was trying to figure out how to describe this book for people who haven't read it yet, which is basically everybody, since it just came out today.
Yeah, that's right.
And then I saw a tweet that you put out this morning where you called it a little book of gay sex love songs, which I thought was basically a perfect summary. I could not top that. But more seriously, I'm curious, like, did you conceive of this book from the beginning that way, or is that something that just sort of organically evolved as you were writing different portions of it?
Very much organically. While I was working on my first novel, What Belongs to You, which is a novel about an obsessive relationship, also set in Bulgaria with the same narrator, it was clear to me that that book was a very streamlined container, and that the world was much bigger than it could contain. And I would write the first couple of chapters of what would become Cleanness were written while I was working on What Belongs to You. I would finish a section of that and write a sort of shorter scene. It wasn't until I had returned to the United States and I had maybe 3 or 4 of these stories that I understood it was a book and had a sense of the structure. And the structure really is, I mean, it's being published as a book of fiction, not as a novel or as a short story collection. People can call it whatever they want. But I actually do think of it, my background is in classical music, and I do think of it as a kind of song cycle. That to me is the truest definition of the structure. It sounds really pretentious, and maybe it is, but like it also feels true to me.
Yeah, it definitely felt like an album of sorts, just in the way it was structured, and there was an ebb and flow of it and a symmetry to it, which was really moving and impressive.
Thank you.
Related to that, I was wondering if you could read a little bit from one of the stories. You agreed to indulge me and read some of the first story in the collection,
sure, happy to.
the lead track,
I like
Mentor. So I'd love to hear some of your reading.
Sure. This was actually, I think, it's funny, so the book is not organized chronologically, and the stories are not at all, or the chapters are not at all in the order that I wrote them in. But actually, this was the first. It's funny, I just realized that. I worked on it over many years, and it transformed a lot, but I think it was the first piece of this book written. I lived in Bulgaria from 2009 to 2013, and I was a high school teacher, like my narrator. The book is not autobiography, but it uses some elements of sort of the details of my life. And I was the only openly queer person in my school community, and the only openly queer person that almost any of my students had ever met in real life. And that meant that students would come and talk to me, students who thought they were queer or knew they were queer. And I had the experience many times of students coming out to me, and I wanted to write a story about that. Not a story based on any particular student, but a story based on that situation. In this story, a student whose name is G, all the characters in the book have initials for names, his name is G, comes to speak to the narrator, comes out to him, and then tells the narrator that the crisis that has brought him to this point is that he has gone through an experience that I think almost every queer person has gone through. It's kind of a queer beatitude, which is realizing that his feelings for his best friend are in fact more intense than friendship, and having a confession of that break that friendship, having the friend reject him after that happens. And so he's telling the narrator about this story, about the story of realizing that he's in love with his friend, and he realizes this, again, this is a very common story, because his best friend gets a girlfriend. And all of a sudden, that makes him realize that he wants to be in that position. And the narrator feels increasingly resistant. I'm going to read the end of the story, and the narrator feels, like at first he's really happy that the kid has come to him, but as the story continues, he feels less and less like he wants to hear it. He was silent for a while, dragging on his cigarette. I was grateful for the pause. I was exhausted by listening to him, by the effort of it in that noisy space, but also by the obligation it imposed, not just to listen, but to feel in a way I had grown unaccustomed to feel. I didn't want him to keep talking. I knew what he would say. It was such an ordinary story, which was what I had tried to tell myself when I was young and felt what G felt now. But for G, it wasn't a story at all. It was the air he breathed. Though it was even less like air than water, it was the opposite of air. Over the next weeks, I lost all the pleasure I had ever taken in my friends, he said. B, this is the boy he loves, B told me about every minute of it, every feeling, and I hated him while he spoke. I hated his happiness. There was so much to feel, G said. I had never let myself imagine what I wanted. I had never in all those years fantasized about him, not once. I hardly fantasized about anything. I didn't want that part of me to exist. But now he was all I could think about. I couldn't concentrate in my classes. And it was true, I thought I had noticed it, the abstraction, the missed work, the fact that so often I caught him staring off into space and had to call him back from wherever he had gone. Every day I saw something I couldn't stand, G said. The two of them kissing or holding hands, they were so happy together. Everything I had looked forward to was ruined. The year was ruined, and I was lonely in a way I had never been before, not just alone, but incapable of being not alone. Do you understand? I looked up at him, having heard the grimace I saw now on his face, a look of such desolation I barely caught myself before I reached for him, wanting to place my hand on his. Though I had been teaching long enough to know never to touch students, or almost never, even innocent touches can be suspect. And he wouldn't have welcomed it, I thought. He wasn't the type to want it. It would have been an intrusion. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe it was precisely what he wanted. Maybe it was some better or wiser part of me I restrained. That's the worst thing about teaching, that our actions either have no force at all or have force beyond all intention, and not only our actions but our failures to act, gestures and words held back or unspoken, all we might have done and failed to do. And more than this, that the consequences echo across years and silence. We can never really know what we've done. G was quiet for a moment, keeping his eyes on the table. When I told him, he went on, it was by accident, almost. I told him all at once and without any plan. We were alone for the first time in weeks out of the city at a house my parents keep up on Vitosha. I knew the area he meant, I thought, a band of exclusive neighborhoods built up the side of the mountain, each year climbing farther up. It was just a half-hour drive from Sofia, but it was like a different world with its own climate, free of the congestion and noise of the center. This was a few weeks ago, he said. We had gone up on a Friday for a quick trip. We were coming back on Saturday. But we planned to spend the whole day there, and it was still morning, and it had been a wonderful night. G was quiet for a while, and then, "What was I thinking?" he said, speaking to himself more than to me. He had waved the waitress away when she approached. The cups in front of us were empty and cold. G had his cigarettes, but I was empty-handed, and suddenly I felt that I should make some gesture of comfort or encouragement, though I wasn't sure how much encouragement I wanted to give. I had heard enough of his story. I wanted to leave the restaurant and the thick air that made my eyes and my throat ache. I wanted him to stop talking. I wanted to go home. I don't know, G said, answering his own question. I wanted it to end, I guess. I didn't want to go back to being so miserable. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe I did have some hope, not that he would feel what I felt, but that he would let me give it to him somehow, that he would receive it. If I could just kiss him, he said, his voice stripped now and small. If I could kiss him just once, that would be enough. I wouldn't want anything more. I looked at him then, wondering if he meant what he said, if he was really so new to desire that he could believe it. I don't think so, I said, speaking for the first time since he had started his story, my voice raw. I don't think that's how it works. It was a ridiculous thing to say. I knew it even as I spoke. Whatever, G said, still not looking up. It doesn't matter. He didn't give me a chance. I told him that I loved him, but he didn't understand me, or he pretended not to understand. I had to explain it. And once I started speaking, I couldn't stop. After being silent for so long, I spoke too much. But it didn't matter what I said. I only made things worse by talking. He didn't welcome it at all, and he hadn't had any idea. I guess I thought he had known it somehow, that he was all I thought about, the only thing I cared about. But he was surprised, really surprised, and he didn't welcome it. He turned away when I kept talking. He wasn't cruel to me, he was gentle, he was even kind, but he didn't pretend we could go on as we had. We would stop being friends, he said. He said he was sorry. He didn't want me to suffer, and it was the quickest way to end suffering, and anyway, he couldn't be comfortable with me now. I was crying then, G said. I don't think he had ever seen me cry before. I couldn't stop. Why did you tell me? He said. I've lost something too. You've taken something from me too. And I realized I had ruined so much for him and for me. I was wrong to tell him, G said. And I shouldn't have said anything, along with everything else now. I'm so sorry for what I said. But there's nothing I can do. I have to live with it, like I have to live with everything else I feel. He paused, and then, but what if I can't bear it, he said, looking up at me, finally catching my eye. And though at first I thought the question was rhetorical, I realized it was genuine. I needed to have something to say. I remembered the confidence I had had hours before in my own competence, the pleasure I had taken in the solace I could give, and I wished I could have some of it back, that it would ease the sense I had now of helplessness and loss, though loss of what, I wasn't precisely sure. An idea of myself, I suppose, which shouldn't have been so precious to me, but was. Other people have gone through this, I began, finding it difficult to speak. Other people have felt it. They bear it, and they get through it. They aren't trapped in it forever. These feelings, I said lamely, all of them, they will get easier. They'll stop being the only thing you feel. They'll fade and make room for other feelings. And then, in time, you'll look at them from far away, almost entirely without pain, as if they were felt by somebody else or felt in a dream. That's what it's like, I said, thinking I had struck on something. It's precisely like waking from a dream. And like a self in a dream, the self that feels this will be incomprehensible to you, and the intensity you feel now will be like a puzzle you can't solve, a puzzle it finally isn't worth your while to solve. I was speaking of myself, of course, of my own experience with love, with overwhelming love that had made me at times such a stranger to myself. But I could see this failing even as I spoke. I could see him recoiling from me, looking at me with an expression first of surprise and then of dismay, and then of something like revulsion. I don't want to feel it less, he said. I don't want it to stop. I don't want it to seem like it wasn't real. It would all be for nothing if that happened, he said. I don't want it to be a dream. I want it to be real, all of it. And who else could I love? He asked, his voice softening. We grew up together in the same country with the same language. We became adults together. Who could I meet wherever I go next who could know me like that? Who could love me as much as he could love me? Who could I love as much? What life could I want except for that life, he said, reminding me of the question I had asked so long before. He hadn't forgotten it. His whole recitation had been an answer. What other life than that could I bear? He raised his hand then, signaling for the waitress and signaling too that our talk was over, that he had exhausted all hope of my helpfulness. And I was both relieved and exasperated by this, and exasperated too by what he had said. But this is a story you're telling yourself, I said, a story you've made up that will make you unhappy. There's nothing inevitable about it. It's a choice you've made. You can choose a different story. But he was already gone, though he was still with me at the table. He was taking out his wallet to pay the check, which I covered with my hand as the waitress laid it down. I've got it, I said, and he thanked me for the coffee and for the talk, as he said. He stood up and put on his coat while I was still counting out bills. And though he stood there willing to wait for me, he was clearly relieved when I let him go, saying I would wait for my change. I watched him as he left, walking hunched over just slightly, carrying away the despair he held on to so tightly, and I told myself he would grow out from under it, that he would go to university and discover a new life in England or America, new freedoms and possibilities, a greater scope for love, and with it room in himself for other feelings. The pain he felt now would become a story he told to others, I thought. And of course he couldn't believe this. Of course it seemed impossible, I told myself. Of course I had failed to make him see it. I walked into the street, breathing in the fresh air and setting off in what I hoped was the direction of the Nevsky Cathedral, from which I was sure I could find my way home. As I walked, I remembered other times I had felt impatience or exasperation with my students' private lives, with their outsized passions and griefs. And I felt this even as I knew that the perspective they lacked couldn't be willed, that it came only and inevitably with time. He would be all right, I thought again, comforting myself by thinking it, though I thought too that he wasn't altogether mistaken in what he had said, that there would be loss in loving another, that the perspective that limited his grief would also limit his love, which, having taken the measure of its bounds, he could never again imagine as boundless. And I had thought this before too, how much we lose in gaining this truer vision of ourselves, the vision I had urged upon my student, the vision it was my obligation to urge, though it carried us away from our dreams of ourselves, from the grandeur of novels and poems which it was also my obligation to impart. How much smaller I have become, I said to myself. Through an erosion necessary to survival, perhaps, and perhaps still to be regretted, I've worn myself down to a bearable size. And then I realized that I had wandered into a maze of narrow streets, the walls on either side too high to glimpse the gold dome of my landmark. And I began to walk more quickly, spurred by the unease that always claims me when I lose track of where I am. Thanks.
Yeah, so I've found this story so familiar yet so unexpected at the same time. It takes a turn in the end. When you're first reading it at the beginning, you sense the narrator's excitement and joy at being able to really help a student. Right. And it just sort of, as the story progresses, it just goes terribly wrong, and I think there's something so heartbreaking about that, but also something very inspiring about it too. And one thing that I was thinking about, there's a lot of contemporary discourse that's very platitudinal. Just it gets better. It's all like it'll all be fine. And I think there are deeper questions. What if it doesn't get better in the way you expect? What if you don't want it to get better in that way?
Right.
And I definitely felt that in your story, and I was curious if you had further thoughts on that as well.
Sure. I mean, I think that's really true. One hopes that it does get better. For a lot of people, it does get better. It got a lot better for me. But it doesn't always get better, and we should be able to talk about that reality too. Teaching in this place in Bulgaria from 2009 to 2013, I mean, the strangest thing about it was how much it returned me to my own childhood. I grew up in Kentucky in the early 90s. I came of age in the early 90s. And I was first generation raised off the farm. In the pre-internet South, it was a kind of devastating place to be queer. And the thing that I realized as my Bulgarian students would talk to me, for all of the differences, obviously, between Bulgaria in the 20-teens and Kentucky in the early 90s, as they told me their stories, they were telling me my story, which is what the narrator feels. I mean, the narrator feels in this story drawn back into this world of his childhood, into the sort of, the lack of perspective that makes one's first love so devastating, because one just doesn't know that you can love someone else. One doesn't know that the grief of lost love gets better. I mean, it's one's only horizon. And, Bulgaria and Kentucky, I mean, I came to realize that these are both places where queer people are taught a single lesson about their lives, which is that their lives lack value and their lives lack meaning. And my queer students who came to talk to me had the same horizon drawn across their lives that I felt I had when I was 12, 13, 14 in Louisville. And, you know, I did feel, you know, this sense of mission to want to try to help. Well, that's a very dangerous feeling. And, you know, something that I realized very quickly was that some situations, almost all situations, I had no power to make better. And, you know, I came out at 14 in a public high school in Louisville, Kentucky. That was a really bad decision. It resulted, my father kicked me out. I failed freshman English because my father kicked me out. You know, it put me in a really dangerous situation. I wish there had been an adult to talk me through that decision and help me understand that I could not safely come out. And this was a conversation I had with my Bulgarian students again and again and again and again. And then, I mean, of course they wanted to live in a more authentic way. They wanted to be open. And, you know, we were trying, adults in the building of good faith were trying very hard to make it a space where that would be more possible. But as I talked these students through these questions of like, can you safely do this? Almost always the answer was no. And I had to accept that I was really limited in what I could offer them. I could give them Frank O'Hara. I could give them James Baldwin. I could give them Virginia Woolf and Jeanette Winterson. But I couldn't give them a world that did not want to destroy them. And that's a devastating situation to be in as an educator. And so I wanted to try to write a story. You know, I mean, those were feelings that I had over 4 years. And I wanted to try to write a story that would let me kind of distill them into one, you know, into sort of this one condensed experience.
Well, I think it definitely succeeded. For me, reading it, being more from the narrator's perspective too, it still moved me really deeply, and I felt this actual meta conversation that was happening between, you know, that stepped outside the context of the story and was sort of like the relationship between the author and the reader. Why am I reading this book? What am I trying to get out of, you know, reading your literature and other queer literature? Am I like, and I almost felt like an authorial struggle with that too. Like, what are you trying to give your readers? And that really shook me quite a bit. And I think that's why the story is so brilliant, and that it sort of sets the stage for all of the stories that continue through the collection. I think where there's a lot in terms of struggling with what it means to be queer and with queer desire and the queer psyche.
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, I think one of the projects of my first 2 books, I do want to sort of grapple with the complexity of this moment we're in, where in certain very privileged parts of the world, in certain very privileged demographics, queer people have access to rights and privileges that I never dreamed they would. I mean, it is still the case that in the majority of states in the United States, you can marry your partner on the weekend and be fired the next day from your job. So, I mean, let's not pretend it's equality. But it's a lot closer than I mean, I never dreamed there would be marriage in America. And I was in Boston when it was legalized here, you know. I never dreamed that the Supreme Court would rule that, you know, my love deserved contractual equality with heterosexual love. That's a powerful thing. This discourse of that sort of says we should be over these, you know, the lessons that we were taught as kids, that like we've moved the world has moved past that, everything is fine. Why do you have to, I mean, people say this to me all the time, why do you have to write about shame? And I think, well, because I know that the lessons that I was taught as a kid are wrong. I know that they're bankrupt, and genuinely do know that. And my narrator too, my narrator for decades has been steeped in queer activism. But I will never get to be, he will never get to be someone who was not taught those lessons. And so the question, you know, my first book is called What Belongs to You, and one of the reasons it's called that is because it's a meditation on the fact that this belongs to us, you know. The narrator, hears his father say to him, "You're not my son. If I had known you were going to be a faggot, you would never have been born," so the books are full of invention, but that is transcribed from my life. That's what my father said to me. I will never get to be someone who did not hear those words. And I can't just sort of say, but now I have access to a rhetoric of pride, which is absolutely life-saving. It was so important when I was 16 years old that I saw the Pride Parade in Louisville, Kentucky. But I can't just say, I have access to that, so all of that shame doesn't belong to me. All of it just falls away. No, it does belong to me. And the question is not, how do we deny it? How do we shut it down? How do we repress it? Nothing good comes from that. The question is, how do we use it? How can we make it productive? And one of the things that to me is endlessly inspiring about queer people is that queer people are geniuses at taking stigma and shame. And I mean, the whole history of queer art is taking stigma and turning it into style, making stigma productive of beauty. And queer activism is making shame and stigma productive of community. I mean, that to me, what extraordinary things that shame can do. Also, when we live in a country in which our president is so utterly shameless, I mean, that is a reminder. You know, when our president says, if I see something I like, I just reach out and grab it, slightly different wording, I feel like, oh, right, that's something else shame does. I am so grateful that I don't think the fact that I want something gives me the right to reach out and grab it. I am so grateful to have been schooled by shame in that way.
As you were talking about that, and as I was reading the story, I was thinking about this tweet that you posted last year that I think is really
oh God, Twitter has a memory, no.
Yeah, it's great. That you said, it isn't just that one learns to be gay, it's that one never stops learning.
Oh, yeah.
So I think that really is speaking to what you were just saying, which is that this is an ongoing project. It's not just sort of that you come out, everything's fine now, and that like all the trauma that you experienced growing up just sort of evaporates and it's all rainbows then. So.
Well, yeah, and I mean, people have different feelings about this, and one of the wonderful things about being a novelist is that I don't have to argue about it. But you know, like, I mean, I don't think queer distinction is just stigma and shame. I mean, I think queerness is a brilliantly, wonderfully affirmative identity. I mean, I think, you know, I think queer art. I mean, the reason I'm an artist is because I think the conversation that is queer art, and a tradition is just a conversation between artists across time, and the conversation that is queer art is, to me, the most exciting, voracious, fabulous conversation. You know, I am so grateful to be queer. I mean, everything that I love about my life comes from the fact that I'm queer. And I would not go back. And this is one way, I mean, here's a way in which, I mean, my books are engaging with queer shame, but not in the way that, say, books in the 1950s did. You know, if you read Giovanni's Room, James Baldwin, which was a book that I think really did save my life when I was a teenager and pulled it off a shelf in Kentucky, the narrator of that book, David, is so desperate to understand why he's gay. He's so desperate to not be gay. He he treats women horribly, trying to convince himself he can be straight. Like, my narrator feels none of that. I mean, my narrator is an out and proud gay man. He likes being gay. He loves it. But that doesn't mean that there's not, you know, those lessons, you know, that have shaped. I mean, he has formed himself. He's formed himself around a wound. And the shape that he has become, I think, is a beautiful shape. I think queer sensibility is a beautiful shape. I wouldn't give it up. But, you know, one doesn't just erase the wound. But yeah, so the idea that one learns to be gay, of course. I mean, gayness, queerness is not something one is, it's something one does. And I mean, queer art, you know, I don't think someone's, you know, people always ask me when you write books, like I ask, like, are you a gay artist, or are you a gay writer, or are you a writer who just happens to be gay? And I'm like, I mean, that's a dumb question, and like, probably deeply homophobic if we really looked at it hard. But I am a queer writer, absolutely. But I'm a queer writer not because I mean, nature, nurture, I don't care. But like, not because I'm gay, but because I've worked really, really hard to sort of earn a spot in this conversation. I mean, you know, this tradition of queerness in art, which is not on the margins, like, which is not like people talk sometimes about a gay ghetto. Writers are told if you write books centered on queer lives, you won't have an audience, which has always been a lie. That has never been true. In 1970, Gordon Merrick wrote The Lord Won't Mind and sold millions of copies with the raunchiest, sexiest books. Like, I mean, people who, like, this sex is unbelievable and like kinky and weird, and people ate it up. Like housewives were buying it at the drugstores. People will buy gay books. It's a lie that there's this gay ghetto. But if there's a gay ghetto, I mean, Baldwin is there, Thomas Mann is there, Henry James is there, Virginia Woolf is there, Jeanette Winterson is there. Like, that's not the margins, that's the heart. I mean, that's the center of the tradition. And you have to work. You know, you don't wake up and go have sex with a boy and then say, I'm gonna, write like Henry James. No, you have to work at it. I mean, queerness is a style, and whether that's queerness in art or queerness in dance or queerness in visual, in writing, it's an apprenticeship. Or queerness in life. I mean, gay people live in fabulous ways and against great adversity, and that's an apprenticeship. It never ends.
One thing I've always been fascinated about with your fiction is the aura of anonymity that you project just by the use. You don't use any real names for any of the characters. Right. We don't know the narrator's name.
Right.
Pretty much every character is either known by an initial or a nickname or both. And what's really fascinating about this to me is in some ways it's so alien to much of our everyday life experience. Like I feel like even more so in modern times when we're constantly texting and IMing each other, like there's just this pervasive attachment of our names to our discourse.
Right.
But it is very familiar and common to queer spaces. And so one thing I feel as I read your work, just seeing like everything be anonymous is just, it feels like sort of a way of queering the fictional universe of the book. And I was curious your thoughts about sort of what you're aiming to project as an author with the usage of so many pseudonyms and the anonymity that you use.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure that out. Because the truth is, there is just something in me that revolts against naming my characters. Like it's a step too far into invention. I tell myself various stories about that. There is a tradition, especially a European or Central European tradition of using initials. It is playing with the reality effect, which a lot of my fiction does. Like I like playing with the reality effect with sort of making people wonder if it's true or false. I am interested in the combination of anonymity and intimacy, which is very much an experience that I associate with my life, with my erotic life, with my affective life. The fact that having an anonymous sexual encounter, say when one's cruising, does not preclude or inhibit affect, feelings of tenderness or of love. And then there's also the fact that so my first education in the arts was in music. I was a singer, an opera singer, and then my second education was in poetry. And everything I know about literature comes from poetry. And everything I know about like how to tell a story comes from opera. And that's good and bad, or neither good or bad. It just is. But in a poem, like the eye of a poem, of a lyric poem, there's a lot of stuff you just don't worry about. Like a lyric poem doesn't have to deliver the kind of Dickensian David Copperfield, this is my name, here's where I'm from, here's what I do, my parents did this, my formative early experiences were this. Like, you don't have to do that. You just say I, and you sort of trust that the reader won't worry about it. Well, people do sometimes worry about it in my novel. I mean, people ask all the time, but like, why is he in Bulgaria? And I'm like, yeah, I guess I don't talk about that. Well, it's just it's just where he is, like I don't care. And so in part, I studied poetry at Harvard. I did half of a PhD. And my great poetry teacher was Helen Vindler, the greatest critic of poetry. And she had this beautiful thing that she would say about a lyric poem, which she said the I of a lyric poem is a universal pronoun, that sort of anyone can occupy it. In the way that like the I of a pop song, you sing along to a pop song, you're singing it. It's not just Taylor Swift who's singing it, it's also you who are singing it. And I often feel like my fiction is trying to sort of create some middle ground between narrative and lyric. And the initials might have something to do with that too. But really, the real thing is that I just don't want to give my characters names. That's just really it.
Noted. So a recurring theme of the novel is just looking at repression and all the ways that it operates and how it affects the queer psyche and how it sort of delineates and constrains the ways that queer people express emotion. So I feel like it's sort of subtly woven into pretty much every story, but it definitely plays prominently in the love story that forms the center of the story.
Right.
Just that, they're constantly conscious of, can we hold hands in this environment? Can we communicate with each other in this environment or that environment? And it infuses that, like, I remember when The Frog King came out, there was a lot of people being like, oh, finally, like this incredibly happy romantic story.
Why is it so sad, they would say? Because it is a happy story.
It's a happy story, but there's sort of this undertone of real melancholy to it, too. And I think part of that may be how it's contextualized in the novel, and that like you have a little more context with the story that precedes when you're reading it. But I'm curious your thoughts as to like how much of that is baked in and inherent to the queer condition, because I find that, like you were talking about earlier, shame and that sort of repression, it molds and etches into the psyche.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that surveillance is part of life for queer people, and I don't care where you live. You can live in Boston, you can live in Manhattan. I think any queer person has a kind of constant meter of comfort with being visible. And, I live in Iowa City now, which is a very liberal place, but there are places really nearby that are not. And so my feeling of how comfortable I am to be, and I am a quite visibly, assertively queer person, but my comfort with that changes radically. In Bulgaria, these two men who are having a relationship in Bulgaria, the center of the book tells a really transformative love story for the narrator. They are in a place where if they hold hands in the streets, they are inviting violence. And what's interesting to me is that repression that you talked about, I mean, it doesn't just shut down, it's also productive. Because like all queer people everywhere, they develop ways to declare their love for each other anyway. And they develop codes, and they develop a way of being in the world. So that's just something that interests me. Like, I don't want to make an argument about it. It's just a state that interests me. And I think in a conservative place like Bulgaria, it might be pronounced, but I think actually it's true for all queer people anywhere. And like, not just places, but also people. So that like, with one sibling, you might be really comfortable with queerness, with another sibling, you might not. And that doesn't mean that you adjust your queerness, but you are aware of that surveillance. Also, I mean, every queer kid understands very early on that our bodies are surveilled and our bodies have to be disciplined, and that gender is a system of violence. I remember how my father would beat me if he thought I was acting in an effeminate way. I remember sitting on my hands, because I use my hands a lot. I remember sitting on my hands so that I wouldn't make a faggy gesture. Every queer kid I know went through that. And you don't get to forget that sort of your body is not something that exists naturally in the world. It is instead something that you have to perform. And one of the things that I love about art, and one of the things that was so miraculous to me in opera, when I began singing opera, was that all of these things that were out of scale and inappropriate for Kentucky tobacco farms on the operatic stage was exactly right. And opera was a world that made a place for me to exist.
One final question for you. I'm going to be the annoying person since your book was published like 3 hours ago. Now, what's next? You have something else in the works as a follow-up?
I do. What's next is like probably a year of wonderful, intense conversations, which is obviously a huge privilege. But when I get to write again, I'm going to write a book about Kentucky. And I've become really fascinated with Kentucky's queer history, with Louisville's queer history, which was a history that, various things I think very decidedly kept me from. But of course, queer people, like I thought Louisville was a deeply un-gay place that I had to escape, but of course queer people are everywhere, and queer history is everywhere, and I've become fascinated by that.
Excellent. So we're going to open it up to audience questions.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, thanks for having me.
For speaking. It's really amazing. I apologize that I haven't read your book yet.
It just came out. There's no way you could have, yeah.
I wanted to, some of the things that you said really resonated with me. A lot of the things you said really resonated with me. Talking about shame being like a formative part of so many queer people and a formative part of art, and that you said you can't just erase that wound, right? I see a lot of the things that I see living in a very privileged place, living in a very privileged country, with respect to the world, is that I think there's part of the community that seeks to erase that wound, or at least forget that it's there. And there's this balance between living as a queer person and like surviving as a queer person, and being aware of that wound and like making sure it doesn't grow to consume you, and sort of forgetting it entirely and sort of just being, sort of moving away from that queer space and not being part of this wider conversation of how do we make the world better for queer people. How do you see that balance playing out for people? Like, how do you see queer people moving? I guess what I'm trying to get at is like, how do we make people aware of that wound without making queer experience just be about being ashamed of yourself forever?
Yeah, which I mean, it's definitely not. And I mean, look, I am someone who believes, and again, I mean, the wonderful thing about being a novelist is that I don't have to convince anybody of this. It's not my job to tell people how to live. I would never want to. I don't think anything good comes from repression. And I think really good things come from transformation. And queer people are geniuses of transformation. I do worry. Occasionally, one sees in the discourse, like especially on Twitter, a kind of desire, not just to erase internal shame, like not just to say, and this, I mean, I understand and admire the fierceness that says, I refuse what my father said to me to have any power over me, like I turn away from that. I just don't think it's true, but like the attitude I admire. I do not admire, and I actually, it's something that causes great rage in me, a desire to do the same thing with the traumas of queer history. And there was an essay not too long ago, which I've like totally blocked off the writer, who I'm sure is a lovely person, I wouldn't want to attack them. But it was basically a rejection of queer history, and sort of saying, I'm sick and tired of hearing about AIDS, which is not history, for one thing. I'm sick and tired of hearing stories of, oppression. I'm sick and tired of learning about ACT UP. I'm sick and, it makes me enraged. Because, the life that I have, I mean, the fact that I can, publish a book like this and have it get the kind of attention it's able to get, I mean, that is due to generations and generations of queer people who did not get that attention. And I feel such intense gratitude and beholdenness. I don't want, look, I think part of the impulse that you're describing comes from something that I wanted to get at with the title of my book, Cleanness. It comes from a desire to want to be scrubbed of shame, a desire to want to have some kind of pure, untarnished, untrammeled, original, innocent state. I think that is the most dangerous desire in the world. Like, we are implicated in a world that necessarily destroys any possible purity we might long for. And I don't think anything good comes from wanting to just scrub it away. I think we have to figure out what can we do with it? How can we make it productive? How can we not just live with it, but how can we make it productive of beauty? How can we make it productive of pleasure? How can we make it productive of community? Those are all extraordinary things to do with what belongs to us.
So I have to confess that I was not aware of you until I saw this talk advertised internally and then started seeing references to you in the press. And so I read, a couple reviews, this book and the previous one, and also articles. And one thing that intrigued me, so they all kind of referenced that you tend to write about sex with a certain amount of vividness, and that they quoted you as saying that you wanted to write passages that were 100% pornographic and 100% literature.
100% high art, yeah.
100% high art. So that really piqued my interest.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know why that was a goal of yours.
Great.
And why it wasn't enough to just kind of draw a veil.
Right, yeah. Thank you for that question. I have a lot of feelings about it. It's a principle of my life that nobody gets to tell anybody else how to make their art. And I'm very against any statement that would say, you should write this way. For me, it feels important to write the queer sexual body, because I think a lot of the very partial and trammeled and unequally distributed equality we enjoy, that came at the cost of a sacrifice of the queer sexual body. I mean, marriage equality in America was won through an advertising campaign that the goal of which was to make America forget that gay men have sex. And if you watch a show like Modern Family, which I think is probably a show that did as much as anything else to convince America that two men can be loving parents to a child. It is impossible to imagine those men having sex. That's not an accident. I think even in our age of marriage equality, the United States despises the queer body, and especially the queer sexual body. And it feels important to me to put the queer sexual body in the center of art, because when you make art out of something, you make a claim about it. You make a claim that it has value. I want not just to write queer sex, but I want to write queer sex that is high art, because I want to use all of the lyric resources of the English language to make a claim about the beauty of what is happening on the page. I also felt, I do not think, it was the biggest surprise of the reception, the biggest surprise of the reception of What Belongs to You was that there was a reception. This little gay book made more noise than anybody thought it would. A lot of that noise was about sex. And people would say to me things like, wow, it's so brave that you wrote these sex scenes. And I was like, what are you talking about? Like, there's hardly any sex in What Belongs to You. There's maybe 3 pages of explicit sex writing. And none of it, I also wanted to say, what are you reading? Like, Samuel Delaney writes brave sex scenes. What Belongs to You, the sex is, I mean, I hope that it's, I don't want to say it's tame. I think but there's not a lot of it. In this book, there's a lot of it. And part of that was just that I felt that there was more to learn there. I don't think there's anything radical about writing sex explicitly, but I thought that there might be a discovery to be made, not just in putting bodies on the page, because we live in a culture in which we are inundated in sexual bodies. We can turn on the computer and hear and see anything we want. But I think there's a dearth of embodiedness, representations of embodiedness, by which I mean representations of bodies that have consciousness. Literature is the best technology we have for the communication of the experience of consciousness. And therefore, I think the best technology we have for representing a kind of sexual embodiedness and representing sex as what I think it is, which is one of our most charged and densely impacted forms of communication. And I thought that writing sex explicitly with the kind of high art Jamesian sentence I like to use, I might make discoveries. And I wanted to see how far I could go. Yeah. Thank you for the question.
I loved what you said about the apprenticeship of queerness, and I wanted to ask if you could expand a little bit more on what it looks like as a journey, and what are some elements of it that are in continuous development.
I think it looks different for everyone. And queerness is not, I'm teaching a course at the Aura Writers Workshop this semester on queer aesthetics. And I really struggled on sort of how to frame it. And its title is Some Recent Queer Aesthetics. Because of course there's not a singular queer aesthetic. And everyone's sort of apprenticeship in queerness looks different. For me, it meant that, my introduction to it, my introduction to the idea that queerness could be an art, was when the choir teacher in my public high school in Kentucky heard something in my voice and started giving me lessons after school. And then he gave me tickets to the opera. And the opera I saw was Benjamin Britten's Turn of the Screw, which was also my introduction to Henry James, who would become the most important English language writer for me, which is a deeply queer opera by a very queer composer who wrote all of his, whose muse was his partner, the great tenor Peter Pears. Opera introduced me to the idea of queer tradition. So a lot of my apprenticeship was singing opera. And then the other part of that apprenticeship when I was very young, and the thing that I do think got me through Kentucky, and sort of kept me going until I could get out, was the fact that there was an independent bookstore in town called Holly Cook. And in a back far corner that I can still see in my mind's eye, although the store has been closed for a long time, there was like a shadowy little section of lesbian and gay literature. And I would timidly go there. I didn't know anything about literature. I would just snatch a book and go somewhere else and read it. And I read Baldwin, I read Jeanette Winterson, I read Woolf, I read Genet, I read Mishima, only because they were in the gay and lesbian section. I didn't know anything about them. That was an amazing apprenticeship. And that's also one of the great gifts of queerness. Because, there's an awful lot that separates me from Yukio Mishima. There's an awful lot that separates me from Jeanette Winterson or from Chinelo Peranta. But, when I was a 14-year-old kid, now, of course, I would nuance and problematize this in all sorts of ways. But when I was a 14-year-old kid, what mattered to me was that they were queer and that was a point of contact. Again, that's too simple. I have an adult sense of nuance and how problematic that is. I also think it's true that queerness allowed me to take those books off the shelf, and for all the differences between my life and Yukio Mishima's life, there are a lot. I could still feel like those books were whispering to me the secret of myself. And that was, and continues to be, a really profound thing. So that was my journey in that apprenticeship. Thank you.
All right, we're gonna wrap up. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, you guys. Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure. Thank you.